2015. Another time, another era. This was when Fate Grand Order had just 57 servants, 22% critical chance rates, and the chimera of the Germanic forest ruled the world. And one of the game's most mediocre servants was Zhuge Liang. Looking back 6 years later, this seems somewhat bizarre. Today, Zhuge Liang, also known as Wave of Velvet, is regarded as one of the best all-around support options in FGO. There is perhaps no servant better in the early game, and his combination of NP batteries and two-way support allows him to retain his utility deep into the endgame, being a key facilitator of 3-turn farming setups. But this was not always the case. When Fate's Grand Order was released in July 2015, Zhuge Liang was the game's sole golden caster. And yet, despite being the game's main support option, he was a divisive and underwhelming figure, if certainly not a terrible servant. But why? Well, there were two main reasons. The first issue lay within his skill set, while the second was his noble phantasm. While Waver's skill set in 2015 may look similar to that in 2021 on paper, there are two major differences. The first was that the value of both Tactician's Advice and Tactician's Command were considerably less than they are today, sitting at a 15% defensive boost and 20% offensive buff respectively, contrasting the 30% values they both are now. But more importantly, none of his 3 skills possessed an NP battery. This Waver was a far cry from the farming linchpin we know today. In its initial phase, Waver's Noble Phantasm, Unreturning Formation, was a shadow of the debilitating cataclysm it would become, while today it offers a guaranteed party-wide NP gauge drain, in addition to a sizable defensive debuff, a chance to stun all enemies, and applies them all with a curse. It used to be far more limited in scope. Critically, the NP gauge drain was not guaranteed, but rather chance-based, scaling with NP level, something which, given Waver's 5-star rarity, could be difficult to upgrade. This was particularly problematic, as knowing whether an enemy can fire their NP the next turn is a vital part of strategic planning in FGO, and a 60% chance at NP1 simply left too much to chance. Furthermore, the defensive debuff simply did not exist, and the curse did half as much damage for only half the time. This combination of a flawed skill set and impotent Noble Phantasm that at worst offered nothing but a minor curse left Waver a middling servant with clear and latent, but ultimately unrealized potential. But thankfully, things would change. Months following the game's release, Zhuge Liang was soon fixed. The values on his skills were improved, and each was now accompanied by an NP battery, allowing him to become the farming facilitating powerhouse he is today. Not only that, his Noble Phantasm was improved. The charge drain was now guaranteed, and it had an accompanying defensive debuff, not to mention that post-Okeanos, it received yet another upgrade, making it all the more potent. Looking at Waver's development in the early game, he is rather reflective of the state of Fate Grand Order itself. Upon release, the game was rather poorly regarded, being incredibly rough around the edges with clunky animations and flawed servants that made even early game content excessively difficult. But as FGO improved, so did Waver 2, and in many ways, he is indeed reflective of the game's rise. At first underwhelming, he blossomed into one of the greatest and most standout servants in the entire game. Not to perfection. There are reasons why the more refined and focused Merlin and Skadi are preferred over the more generalist Waver. But while there is room for improvement, Zhuge Liang, like FGO itself, has sure come